Hello, everyone, and welcome. Let me briefly introduce myself. I am Dr. Sarah Jordan, an assistant professor here at Johns Hopkins SAIS with a joint appointment in environmental health and engineering. I am very grateful that Dr. Kent Calder has agreed to provide opening remarks to this event. He has not only recently been serving as the interim dean of SAIS, but he is also the Edwin O. Roschauer Professor of East Asian Studies and directs the Roschauer Center. He's well placed to give these remarks with both his academic but political experience, having served as special advisor to the U.S. ambassador to Japan and many other prestigious positions across academic institutions such as Princeton and Harvard. He has published a wealth of literature related to energy and many of the markets related to the product we're talking about today, liquefied natural gas. Kent, welcome, and thank you again for your participation.
Sarah, thank you very much, and congratulations on the extraordinary event that you have organized here relating to greenhouse gas implications of LNG. Of course, the evolution of LNG and the transformation of energy markets has been something that has fascinated me and been a major part of my own work over the past 25 to 30 years, as many of you know. My particular interest in involvement has had to do with Asia's rising energy demand. Of course, China, a major element of that, but even before, and also quantitatively even more important in LNG markets, the rise of Japan, the very rapid growth of Japan across from the late 1950s right until the oil shock of the two oil shocks of the 1970s. And then, of course, not so long after that, from the mid 60s, particularly the rapid growth of Korea. And so, as so many of you know, those two countries, first Japan and then Korea, have been the pillars of LNG demand worldwide for a good part of the last 3 decades, and even to this day constitute well over half of the LNG transoceanic trade. Within North America, of course, as people like Professor Jordan, whom we're so lucky to have with us, have noted, the trade within North America, of course, has risen and become more and more substantial. So LNG is an increasingly important part of our energy mix, and particularly, of course, across the past decade. One major stimulus on the demand side was the great earthquake in Japan in 2011, which of course led the nuclear program that had been so important prior to that, which crippled that and led to the closing of nuclear plants. And it was really LNG that took its place. So LNG had been important before that, but after 2011, with the Japanese tsunami, and then also, of course, the very, very rapid recent growth of China, LNG has been becoming increasingly important. Not to mention also, of course, countries such as Britain, in which LNG also has been quite important. Now, with our proximity to COP26, concern about the environment, about greenhouse gases, the timing is so important for the event that we are going to have today. And so it interests me tremendously. I'm really pleased that SAIS is able to do this sort of an event with Professor Jordan, Professor Hangel, so many colleagues, and also our visitors. It gives me a real pleasure to introduce this important event. So thank you very much for joining today.
And thank you to you as well, Dean Calder. Very appreciative of your joining in. Before we start, I want to extend a warm welcome to our speakers and to our audience. I'm delighted to see such broad representation of perspectives in our invited panel reflected in those who are joining us. A quick note, this event is hosted by both Johns Hopkins SAIS, the new Development, Climate, and Sustainability Program, but also my research group, the Energy, Technology, and Policy Assessment Group, or ETAPA. I want to recognize Emily Spurring, an undergraduate research assistant with my group, whose enormous help made this event possible, as well as the SAIS staff who helped. When a former postdoctoral fellow on one of my research projects, Dr. Adebola Kusumu, approached me to hold this event, I thought to myself about how timely and important it is, given the increasingly global nature of this industry. As mentioned by Dean Calder, ahead of next week's climate negotiations, our discussion is coming at a critical time. To meet Paris goals, the importance of reducing greenhouse gas emissions is more critical than ever. The newly revised scenarios published by the International Energy Agency, for example, those that meet climate goals, provide an even more conservative growth in natural gas when compared with previous years, placing more pressure on all sectors involved with this industry. After my first book was recently published, Wells to Wire, I realized it was an excellent opportunity to broaden the discussion to include an array of very important and sometimes divergent perspectives on this matter. As a result, I'm especially excited to be moderating this distinguished panel of speakers. We're going to start off with Andrew, Bola, and Wes, who will be kicking off the discussion with their recent report. Mr. Andrew Browning is a SAIS alumnus, one of the principal founders and president of the Western States and Tribal Nations Natural Gas Initiative. With over 25 years of public and private sector experience, including the Director of Government Relations at Methanex and at the White House, as an appointee to the Department of Energy during the Clinton administration. Dr. Bola Kusumu is a registered professional engineer, consultant, and researcher specialized in energy and the environment. After he obtained his doctoral degree in chemical engineering from the University of Calgary, Canada, he worked with me and our colleagues on life cycle emissions implications associated with LNG export from Canada, leading to a publication in the prestigious journal Environmental Science and Technology. Wes is the Deputy Assistant Director of Oil and Gas at the Utah Institutional Lands Administration, with over a decade of experience of working in the oil and gas industry as a landman. He has served an important role in the development of this project. Before I turn it over, I will run through the rest of the speakers, as you'll know how it will proceed. We will then hear the EU perspectives from Ms. Mercedes Garcia Perez, who is the head of global issues and innovation at the delegation of the EU to the US. A lawyer by training, she has outstanding experience in the area of EU foreign policy and security strategy. We are lucky to have her provide the EU perspective on this topic, particularly with the 2020 adoption of the Methane Strategy. I am very excited that Mark Brownstein has joined us. He is the Senior Vice President of Energy at the Environmental Defense Fund and a member of EDF's executive team. He leads the EDF's energy program globally. Their focus is to halt the rise of global greenhouse gas emissions from the oil and gas sector on a path consistent with a 2050 zero carbon future. As many of you know, EDF has played a critical role in understanding and reducing methane emissions associated with oil and gas supply chains. We will then learn more about the industry perspective from Fiji George, who is the Senior Director of Climate and Sustainability at Cheniere Energy. Fiji has more than 26 years of experience covering corporate climate and sustainability strategy. He is a co-author of multiple peer-reviewed scientific papers, and importantly, he is also the architect of the design of the One Future Coalition, a voluntary methane reduction program. For those of you in the audience, please do pose any questions you may have in the Q&A box, and I will be keeping track of these so that they can be addressed in the moderated discussion. So I don't want to spend any more time talking. We'll run through the speakers and we will commence the moderated discussion. I'm now going to pass over to Bola, Andrew, and Wes.
Thank you, Dr. Jordan. In the interest of time, I'm going to speak for both Western states and tribal nations and Utah School and Institutional Trust Lands Administration, who we worked with on the report. Up front, Western states and tribal nations is a very unique organization founded by Western state and tribal governments to advance the agenda on natural gas in the policy and regulatory arena. Our states represented in our organization include the state of Utah. State and tribal governments include the state of Utah, the Ute Indian tribe, the state of Wyoming, the state of Baja California, Mexico, the state of New Mexico, the Southern Ute Indian tribe, and the Western Colorado counties that make up the Piceance natural gas basin. The Rocky states are leading in methane regulations with some of the strictest standards, some of the cleanest molecules in the world. Understanding energy policy, especially through this administration, is really being developed through the prism of climate change. We worked with Utah SITLA and commissioned Dr. Kasumu on the report with really three areas of focus. One, whether or not natural gas produced in the Rockies basins and exported via LNG from the North American West Coast to Asia for power generation could provide a net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions when compared against Asian coal for power generation. Second, whether or not Asian countries have a strong enough dependency on coal for power generation to provide significant disruption potential from West Coast North American LNG. And then third, whether or not there are enough natural gas resources or reserves within the collective Rockies basins. We're now producing, I think, around 11.5 BCF a day to support long-term global demand of LNG from the North American West Coast. And now I will cede the rest of my time to Dr. Kasumu to give some of the top line data and conclusions from the report. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Browning. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adebola Kasumu, and I'm going to be presenting the results highlights from the report that was just spoken about by Andrew a few minutes ago. The report came out a few months ago, and it's titled Life Cycle Assessment of Greenhouse Gas Emissions from Liquefied Natural Gas Exports from North America's West Coast for coal-displaced electricity generation in Asia. I'm the key author of this report, and I work together with Dr. Lauren Bergenheyer and Dr. Kerry Kelly, both from the University of Utah. First of all, the premise of this study was based on a 2018 peer-reviewed publication in Environmental Science and Technology that Sarah had mentioned earlier, which I worked on together with her and other authors back when we were at the University of Calgary together. In this study, we had looked at the life cycle assessment of Western Canadian natural gas for export to Asian countries for electricity generation. And we had looked at different scenarios and what would be the effect of the Canadian LNG displacing local sources of electricity generation under different scenarios. And we had factored in country level factors such as electricity transmission and distribution, ocean transport distances, and power plant efficiencies. And on the right-hand side is a snippet of some of the results from the study that came out in 2018 that shows what the effect of Canadian natural gas displacing electricity generation in Asian countries would be under different scenarios. And one of the main conclusions of this study at that time was that the potential economic and environmental implications for exporting natural gas from Canada to the Asian Pacific region was compelling, especially when it was exported to countries like China, India, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. The image on the right-hand side that you see is an image of Western United States, which shows the Rocky Mountains basins. When this study was commissioned, it was supposed to be based on the premise using the same methodology that we had used in the initial study of 2018 for Western Canada. And this study was supposed to look at natural gas being extracted from US Rocky Mountain basins and exported through to North American West Coast LNG export facilities located in Jordan Cove and Baja California, as shown in the diagram. And these Rocky Mountain basins include Green River, Pian, San Juan, Uinta as the main ones, and smaller ones that are listed on the list. And it's worthy to note that all of these Rocky Mountain basins span across, they spread across 4 states of Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. So as I mentioned earlier, the same methodology that we had used in the earlier study was adopted for this study as well. In the main report, due to time, it's impossible to present a lot of details from the report, but it's worthy to note that in the report, we have presented a lot of data regarding the undiscovered gas resources, the proven reserves, the historical annual production data from the US Rocky Mountain basins. And our calculation from all of these data shows that if we keep the 2017 production levels, we will be able to ramp up production to supply these LNG facilities 22.8 megatons per annum of natural gas for at least 12 years based on the proven reserve figures alone. But we know that this is constantly changing, and when we consider the undiscovered resources, the number goes very much higher. Also in the report, we have presented data sources, the methodologies for estimating emission factors for all life cycle stages. We have also presented the natural gas extraction, all of the stages from natural gas extraction to electricity, transportation and distribution in import countries. That is the emission factors for all of those stages. We also presented global LNG market data and LNG trade data as well. Also in the report, we would find what we present to be the total electricity generated between 2010 and 2018 in the potential import countries, and also the electricity generated particularly from coal and natural gas, how it has changed over time historically, which leads us to make a conclusion that there is a lot of opportunity for North American and natural gas to be exported to these potential import countries. And for the sake of time, I'm only going to be presenting a few of the results that we have from the report. Based on, as I mentioned earlier, the export of 22.8 megatons per annum equivalent of US West Coast LNG, and using it to displace coal-fired electricity generation in the 5 countries that were considered in Asia. We found out that based on a life cycle basis, there is a lowering of the net life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from when this LNG is used to displace coal-fired electricity generations in the countries of China, India, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And as shown on the chart, there is a lowering if all of this 22.8 megatons per annum is used to displace coal-fired electricity in Japan. It lowers the life cycle emissions factor by about 45%, and all of the other figures are shown in the chart. In the last 1 minute that I have, I'm just going to show a slide that gives the absolute figures that gives the absolute figures in megatons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year, based on the same amount of 22.8 megatons per annum, which we calculate to generate about 157 terawatts of electricity. The lowering of greenhouse gas emissions range from 67.2 to 119.6 megatons of CO2 equivalent per year, based on the figure that we have generated. And in conclusion, some of the conclusions that we have from the report, of course, as was said during the introduction, that energy demand is continuously growing, and then the LNG demand potential is high, not just for power generation, but for other uses, and North American LNG can play a role. We also conclude that LNG could serve as a bridge fuel to achieve the GHG reduction goals globally. Other conclusions include the fact that North American LNG can both be economically and environmentally beneficial. And with that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kasumu. Please do stop sharing your screen, and we will welcome Miss Mercedes Garcia Perez to turn on her. There we go. Please do go ahead.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and thank you very much to Professor Jordan, who's given me permission to call her Sarah from now on, and of course to Dean Calder for the invitation to speak at this event. I'm delighted to be in this panel to present the EU perspective. I'm going to share my screen to present to you a couple of quick points. Since we are so close to the COP26 in Glasgow, that's starting in a few days at the beginning of November, I want to take this opportunity to present the EU goals for COP26. And it's actually very good that this is directly linked to methane, since we're going to co-launch with the United States a global methane pledge that I'll say a bit more about in a moment. So we share with the US the objective of maintaining 1.5 degrees Celsius of global temperature rise within reach and in line with the Paris Agreement. And we've been engaging with nations across the globe, as the US has been, to push them into more ambition. So the first theme of this COP, as you would have seen from the press, is ambition. And this is a shared goal with the United States. Special Envoy Kerry was saying recently that when he started the job a few months back under the Biden presidency, only the UK and the EU were within with objectives that had 1.5 within reach. I think we've seen that picture change quite a lot within the last few weeks and months, which is of course very important. But we're not yet there. We're much closer than we were, but we're not yet there. So we need to continue to push for ambition. And this is done hand in hand by our Executive Vice President, Timmermans, and John Kerry, who engage and exchange very often about their own engagement with other countries. The second big objective for COP26 is to achieve the 100 billion pledge of developed nations funding to deliver climate adaptation and mitigation, and to finance support to the least developed nations. And we're very close to closing the gap. We hope that there might still be other announcements, but the EU has done more than its fair share, especially taking into account the recent announcement by President von der Leyen, who's put an additional 4 billion on the table. So we are very, very happy that this is also going in the right direction. Of course, the big issue is how we reach the bigger targets that are actually needed in terms of investment, and that will require mobilization also of the international development banks and also of private sector. Finally, there is the more detailed and technical discussions on transparency, the completion of the Paris rulebook that is also necessary, and this has to do with carbon markets, among others. So I won't get into that because it's complicated, but it's also part of our objectives. And of course, as I mentioned before, one of the big events that we're going to have in COP26 is that we're going to launch together with the US the Global Methane Pledge. This is something relatively recent that we've launched together, and we're very happy to cooperate with the US on this. So we've done quite an innovative, I think, example of joint diplomacy. We've reached out to nations around the globe to convince them to join this pledge. And what do nations commit to? Is actually a global commitment to reduce by at least 30% from 2030 levels by 2030. And doing so by investing in the best possible methodology to quantify methane emissions with particular focus on high emission sources. And of course, delivering on this pledge, so this 30% overall reduction would reduce warming by at least 0.0 degrees Celsius by 2050, which is significant when we're looking at 1.5. So we have already over 50 countries that have agreed to sign the pledge. And we hope that others will join as well. As you know, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. So quick reductions within the next decade of methane will actually make a significant difference in overall reductions, and therefore in reaching 1.5. So all of this we do obviously within the framework of the European Green Deal that was already published in December 2019. We had a very strong and clear mandate from the previous European elections of the European Parliament to go big on green, and that's exactly what the Commission delivered by presenting the Green Deal already in December 2019. In October 2020, as has been mentioned before, we had the EU Methane Strategy presented to the world. And this is because we account for about 10% of global greenhouse, in Europe, methane accounts for 10% of greenhouse emissions. And a lot of them are actually not from energy, the energy sector. It's only 19% of EU emissions that come from the energy sector, which is interesting to note. A lot of it, of course, is from the agricultural sector, more than 50%, and 26% from waste. So all of this has to be tackled. We will focus on anthropogenic methane emissions with this strategy, and we have a number of proposals that are already sketched in the methane strategy, and some of them will become legislative proposals already this year in December. So the first one, of course, is the support to the International Methane Observatory, and we're very happy that this already is in existence. We cooperate with the UN Environmental Programme, the Clean Air Coalition, and the International Energy Agency for the establishment of IMEO, of the Methane Observatory. That's already in place. Other proposals were to deliver a number of legislative proposals that will be announced in December, as I mentioned before. One of them is to eliminate routine venting and flaring in the energy sector. And the other one is to address methane emission reductions in all relevant sectors with partner countries. And part of that will also be to establish compulsory measurement, reporting, and verification for all energy-related methane emissions, and an obligation to improve leak detection and repair of leaks. So we're going to do our homework inside the European Union to try and reduce methane emissions as much as possible. Part of the Methane Emission Observatory, which really has three main principles, is to provide transparency, ideally aggregating company reporting, satellite data, and measurement from scientific studies. We will have a much better picture than we have at the moment of what exactly is being emitted where. And we will be able to use that for the implementation of the targets. So as you just heard, a number of countries have committed to collectively reach a 30% reduction, but we need to have reliable data to be able to measure those reductions. So transparency is linked to implementation. And of course, it's also linked to the third pillar of the observatory, which is science. Accurate and publicly available data and improved methods of assessment will obviously contribute to this. We are very happy that the methane observatory will also include a methane supply index, which is forthcoming. So at the moment, what happens is that the EU, of course, is an importer of gas. The US is an exporter of gas. So if we want to, we need to look at the whole cycle of emissions to know what we are importing and what's the carbon footprint of the energy that we are importing. At the moment, there's no difference between very clean and ultra low methane emissions gas with extremely dirty, with high emissions gas. There's no way to make a difference between those two products. In the future, the methane supply index, which will be developed by IMEO, will be a global emissions index for gas imports. So we want to use our position as an importer of energy, and in particular, in this case, LNG and gas in general, to be able to better measure the greenhouse emissions of our imports. And this methane supply index will track the methane emissions of different gas supply sources, both in the EU, but also at the international level. That's why the IMEO is so important, because we need reliable data to be able to establish these measurements and take action in consequence. So in closing, I just wanted to reiterate that because the EU is an importer of gas and other energy sources, we think it's important to measure the greenhouse emissions of all of the energy that we import if we want to reach our ambitious targets for COP26 and beyond to be net zero by 2050. And while a shift to natural gas in some cases will actually contribute to reduce those emissions, we need to make sure that that is sustainable gas, and therefore that enough transparency is created to make sure that we are certain that gas is as clean as possible. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Mercedes, Ms. Garcia Perez. Just for the audience, anyone who's joined, please do use the Q&A function to add your questions, any questions you may have for the moderated event. Mercedes, you may turn off your video. And now we will go to Mark Brownstein. Mark Brownstein, please do turn on your video.
Both turn on my video and unmute myself here. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for hosting this. Thank you for taking on this topic. I'm very pleased to be here. Methane, of course, is an incredibly important topic for the future of LNG and the future of natural gas. It drives methane emissions in the atmosphere drive 25% or more of the warming that our planet is experiencing right now. And the most recent statement of the science from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change speaks to the fact that there is virtually no way for us to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement absent aggressive action to reduce methane emissions alongside all of the work that the countries of the world are doing to reduce carbon dioxide from their economies. We need to do both. This is not an either or, this is really one and two. Methane drives the rate of warming, whereas carbon dioxide determines the total amount of warming we'll experience over time, and therefore a complete strategy to deal with climate change really deals with both of those variables. So that's why everyone's talking about methane. And of course, we very much applaud the leadership that the European Union has shown. We very much anticipate the United States soon rolling out federal regulations to address oil and gas methane emissions, maybe as early as tomorrow. And the leadership that the United States has shown in partnership with the European Union in sponsoring, if you will, or introducing this idea of a global methane pledge. But I want to, in my few minutes here, I want to address a little bit of the science. Because one of the things that Environmental Defense Fund, some of you may know, has spent the better part of over 10 years now working on this issue. And much of what we've been doing has actually been going out into the field and working to get better data through field measurements. And one of the things that we have learned over the course of our 10 plus years working on this issue is that the traditional method of doing reporting on methane emissions for the industry, using doing engineering calculations based on emission factors, more often than not works to understate the total amount of emissions that are coming from any particular company, any particular production basin, any particular country. And just to give you an example of this, we have been doing overflights, tower measurements, using a variety of different measurement techniques, both bottom up and top down, in the Permian Basin over the last 2 years. And what we've learned over the course of those 2 years is that emissions in the Permian Basin, so of course that's West Texas and eastern New Mexico, that's where the lion's share of US oil and gas comes from, emissions in the Permian Basin are 3 to 5 times higher than what's being reported in official federal EPA inventories. Now, what are the reasons for that? Well, one thing that we've learned from our overflights is that flaring, which is ostensibly a strategy to reduce the venting of raw methane into the atmosphere, is actually a major source of emissions. In our overflights and other work that we've done, we found that 10% of the total flares in the Permian Basin are either unlit, that is venting uncontrolled methane completely, or only burning part of the gas that they've been designed to burn. In other words, incomplete combustion. We estimate that at least 7% of the Permian gas sent to flares is escaping directly into the atmosphere. And that means that flares in the Permian are emitting 3 to 5 times more than what EPA assumes when it uses emission factors to determine emissions for flares. Second thing that we've learned in the Permian is that there oftentimes is a very tight relationship here between production and emissions. Back in March to April of 2020, when we had the COVID crisis on top of the Russia and Saudi Arabia price war, when oil dropped to negative value, there was a 60% plunge in the impact of production in the Permian Basin as a result of that dramatic drop in demand, along with that dramatic increase in supply. But what we saw is that the minute production came back, and emissions dropped along with that decline in production. So those emissions in the Permian Basin I talked about dropped, okay? But they came right back when production resumed. And so what we're learning from that experience is that oftentimes, and particularly in the Permian, there's a reasonably tight relationship between production and emissions. We tend to think that part of what's happening in the Permian is that the price of oil is determining the value of production, and much of the gas is going to waste because it's just really marginal to the economic value of the wells that are being drilled and produced. But the last thing that we've learned from our field studies recently is that marginal wells, which make up 80% of all active wells in the United States, they account for just 6% of total oil and gas production in the US, but they're actually 80% of the total number of wells, are actually a major source of emissions. We, through the field studies that we and others have done, we believe that fully half of methane emissions from the oil and gas industry are coming from these marginal wells. And so all of this speaks to the absolute importance of going out and getting real field data. And of course, was just mentioned, that is exactly what the International Methane Emissions Observatory is in part all about, is to encourage both countries and companies to gather data. The European Union, among others, has been a champion of the oil and gas methane partnership, where you now have 70 companies around the world, many of them European, most of them European, who have now committed to doing actual in-field measurements rather than emission estimates to do their reporting. And what we really need to see is we need to see more companies in the United States, in the Middle East, and elsewhere sign up to that commitment. Because we know from our own field studies that estimated emissions just really don't give us the information we need. And the analyses that we do based on estimated emissions are likely to be wrong. Of course, satellites and other new technologies are going to help us get more of that information quicker. And of course, the International Methane Emissions Observatory is being constituted in part to enable us collectively to get hold of that information in a public sphere and make sure that that information is well understood and well distributed to policymakers and industry alike, so that we can all be using better data as we go forward. The last point that I will make is that regulation, in fact, matters. It was said earlier in this seminar that production in the Rocky Mountain states is relatively clean. Some of the reason for that is that the state of Colorado was the first political jurisdiction anywhere in the world to implement methane control regulations for both new and existing sources. And in fact, Colorado has continued to improve the quality of their regulations. They did the first ones in 2014. They've successively worked to improve them. And in fact, Wyoming and Utah have each included leak detection and repair requirements in their own regulations based on the work that Colorado has done. So we have reason to think that emissions could be lower in the Rocky Mountain states, but that's precisely because the states have acted to actually regulate these emissions. But this is not just about production standards, whether it's in the US or the European Union or Canada or Mexico or elsewhere. This is also about making sure that major importers are also doing their part. And of course, we just heard about the European Union's efforts to get a handle on emissions associated with their consumption. I firmly believe that to the extent that Korea and Japan and China are large gas customers and likely to be so for the next several decades, means that they too are soon going to have to take ownership for the emissions associated with their consumption patterns. And so reducing methane emissions through import standards are going to be only more necessary for those countries in the years ahead. With that, I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Mark. Next, we will turn to Fiji. Mark, if you could turn off the video, and Fiji, there we go, and the mute. Okay, thank you. Go for it.
Thank you, Sarah. I've got a short presentation to go through, so I'll go through it pretty quickly. Appreciate the invite and the opportunity to talk about this very important topic. So my name is Fiji George, and I'm with Cheniere. And before I start, since we're a publicly traded company, this is the proverbial safe harbor statement. Quickly.
Okay, just let me know.
Great. So if we could go to slide 3. So quick overview about Cheniere. So we started commercial operations 5 years ago, and we moved from being a developer to a world-class operator. Since then we've exported about 1,700 cargoes globally, we to 36 countries. We are the second largest liquefaction platform, and we hold 10% of the global LNG liquefaction capacity. We also are one of the largest consumers of natural gas in the United States, if not the largest on any day. And we also hold one of the largest pipeline nomination capacity in the US network. So next slide, please. Just a quick note on the fundamentals for the future. Looking at it from a supply-demand perspective, we expect robust LNG demand, mainly driven by the Asian markets. Next slide, please. A quick overview on a variety of actions we have undertaken, and there's a lot that in this discussion that I agreed with what Mark Brownstein and speakers before have said. So that's one of the reasons we, as an LNG exporter, have decided to undertake and include ESG as a core competency within the firm. So early this year, we announced the issuance of cargo emission tax. That is, every cargo that leaves our two facilities in Sabine Pass in Louisiana and Corpus Christi in Texas will have an emission label per se on the profile of the emissions intensity associated with the cargo. We also conducted a climate scenario analysis consistent with the TCFD, or Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure recommendations. We stress tested the supply based on a less than 2 degree scenario from the IEA. And we also have undertaken multiple scientific studies with our partners in the production side who supply gas to us, and also the shipping. I'll talk about these in a little while. And finally, I want to emphasize the point on the life cycle model that we have developed. Next slide, please. So early this year, we published a life cycle analysis in ACS, along with colleagues from University of Texas, Queen Mary's University in London, and Duke. And there are about 5 key points. And what's different between this life cycle analysis and others are the fact that we have customized the life cycle model to represent the suppliers that supply gas to us to make the LNG and the ships that deliver these to our end customers. So one of the key findings is national or regional average supply chains do not accurately represent what is unique to us. For our work for the year 2018, our supply chain specific emissions were 30 to 43% lower than other studies. Then the number 2 point is upstream emissions are significant, and I'll talk about this in the next slide. What is also equally important, can we go back to the previous slide, please? Yes, what's also equally important is the coal supply chain, especially if you're comparing gas versus coal. The coal upstream supply chain is equally important. We ran a case using very regional data in China, showing that the upstream coal emissions, mainly due to methane emissions, can be about 20% of the entire life cycle emissions of the coal plant. And then the very important tool is, if you are going to develop policies, whether it's Europe or other countries, or customers making policies or strategies on gas supplies, it's really important to have a tool like what we've developed for assessing the differentiation of the gas supplies to the market. And we, depending on where we buy the gas, how we transport, how we load the cargo, can have a completely different profile from another competitor in the US or another country. So customized framework LCAs are really critical for this work. And lastly, consistent with Bola's finding, our analysis showed about 47 to 57% less intensity relative to coal plant in China. And next slide, please. So I want to emphasize the importance of methane and the reason why we should focus on methane reductions. So our analysis shows that methane can be about 30 to the upstream portion before combustion is about 30 to 40% of the total profile, and methane as such is a significant portion of the total emissions, especially on the upstream production side, transmission, and shipping. Whether you look at it on a 100-year basis or 20-year basis, of course, it's amplified in a 20-year basis. So methane is a really important pollutant to address in the life cycle analysis, in the life cycle analysis and any policy thereof. Next slide, please. So we, in the paper, slide 8, please. In the paper, we run a sensitivity, a what-if scenario. What if we reduce methane emissions in the upstream by 50%? You can see a pretty significant amount of reduction on a value chain basis, about 14 to 24%, depending on the GWP. Again, reinforces the points that Mark was making on the importance of dealing with methane. So next slide, please. So what are we doing about it? You heard Mark's talk about uncertainty with methane emissions, and I've got I presume the slides will eventually be available to the audience, but I've got a slide in the appendix that talks about sensitivity with different numbers, including work from EDF. But what's Cheniere doing about it? So we initiated a program called QMRV, Quantification, Monitoring, Reporting, and Verification, a collaboration with 5 of our supplier partners in 3 different basins with multiple academic institutions. And our partners are Pioneer in the Permian, Ascent and EQT, large producers from the Marcellus Basin, and Aethon and Indigo from the Haynesville. These are key producers. So what we try to do is we try to bring in academia, we have developed a protocol on how we do these measurements and monitoring and verification. We have a double verification process, by the way. So what we do is come in, do a baseline assessment with multiple technologies, all the way from satellites to OGI cameras. Then we have a 6-month period where the operator monitors their facilities on a very frequent basis using enhanced techniques. And we encourage the use of continuous monitoring and detection systems. Data, emissions, operations, maintenance data is reviewed by the academics. They make a judgment call on the numbers and issue the final report. So our objectives are essentially as follows. We want to assess the efficacy and scalability of these monitoring technologies. As Mark mentioned, they're satellites, they're aerial technologies. We want to assess the efficacy and scalability. Number 2, how far or close are these emissions relative to the estimation methods provided by the EPA when we have actual monitoring going on, robust monitoring going on? What are the reduction opportunities? And eventually this data will be fed into our LCA model. As you know, it's a model, it's data agnostic. Better the data, better the results. And this will support our tags. So we started this effort with the production side. We also did a project with Paul Balcombe with Queen Mary's University through our collaboration with an entity called CAMS that we co-founded. That's the Collaboratory to Advance Methane Sciences. This was the first time, again, actual methane emission monitoring and CO2 monitoring on a ship and the entire voyage, from the time the LNG was loaded on the ship to delivered and the ship coming back. So this was done on the Cheniere chartered vessel called Gaslock Galveston. It was a round trip from Cheniere's Corpus Christi facility to a discharge port in Europe. The study the paper is being written up by Paul, and we plan to publish it soon. In addition to the QMRV LNG, we have drafted a QMRV protocol for the midstream sector. We're going to do the similar efforts for midstream, that is transmission, processing, gathering, and boosting. All this enhances the science. All this enhances the strategy that we're going to adopt. And finally, I mentioned about the cargo emission tax. So the cargo emission tax is essentially providing the customers an assessment of the CO2e profile of cargo loaded from our facilities using our model. Again, thank you for your time. Apologies for the technical issues at the beginning.
Okay, so I'm going to invite now all of our speakers to please turn on your video for the moderated discussion. We already have a number of questions that have come in, and many of them going to different speakers. So we'll address those up first, and then I'm going to ask some broad questions for all of you. The first is from one of our students, Inuva Flores, who asked, and I believe this is an annual amount, if speaking of the GCF, but she asks the Green Climate Fund, and my apologies, she asks to Mercedes that $100 billion funding is per year for a certain period of time, e.g. 5 to 10 years.
Yes, so just very briefly, it is a promise to provide an annual amount of 100 billion per year all together. So all of the developed nations made this promise actually 12 years ago already in Copenhagen, and they made that promise with the horizon of 2020. So that's why it's so important that we manage this year at least to deliver on that promise. And as I was saying before, the EU has done its fair share and more than its fair share. And with the recent promise to deliver an additional 4 billion euros, we will be delivering in the years to come until 2025. I think is an additional 36 billion per year.
Thank you. And of course, a very important aspect of green climate finance, particularly as the GCF becomes established and the need to start dispersing those funds. We will now go to the next question, which is posed by Satoshi Marukawa to Bola, who says, "Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Kisumu. You mentioned that LNG is an important bridge fuel. Specifically, this is a tough question, and I talk about this a bit in my book, but it's a tough question. They ask, specifically, how many years do you expect that LNG will be used into the future? From the perspective of businesses and investors, investing in LNG is a long-term commitment, and how long will LNG be used as an important factor in making investment decisions?" Oh, you're on mute still.
Thank you for that question. Sorry for that. First of all, I won't pretend to be a business advisor, but what I can say is that how far into the future LNG will continue to be used will depend on a host of things. For example, I believe McKinsey came up with a report, I believe last year, that lists a couple of factors that would determine how far into the future LNG will continue to be used, such as, supply chain optimization, decarbonization, digital and advanced analytics and things like that. But one thing I wanted to mention is that in the previous presentations that came after me, I believe Mark mentioned that Japan, Korea, and China would likely continue to be, LNG importers for decades to come. I believe that's what you said, right? And I also believe Fiji also, mentioned something that showed a slide that showed growing LNG demand into the 2040s, I believe. So I think it's reasonable to say that depending on how the energy demand continues to increase and how fast the transition takes place from fossil-based energy generation to other sources of energy generation, that will determine how far into the future energy LNG will continue to be in demand. But it's reasonable to say it's certainly for at least a couple of decades to come.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Very important one, because obviously one can presume there's only so much higher carbon electricity to displace. So becoming a very important question moving into the future. Great to see all these student questions coming up. Here's another student in my climate class, I believe. And do please use the question and answer box to add your questions. Jack states, does EDF partner with any energy providers? If not, how does the EDF methodology differ from other firms focused on emissions measurements?
Well, it's a little difficult to answer the question without knowing what other firms one's talking about, but I can say that our methodologies, so all of our studies are in partnership with academic institutions, and oftentimes also in partnership with folks in industry. I mean, over the course of the 30 some odd studies that we've done and over 86 papers that we've either authored or facilitated, peer-reviewed papers, I think what we've worked to do is try to create data that is robust, that is transparent, and that is peer-reviewed. We're in the process now of building a satellite to collect information, and that too, when that is launched at the end of 2022 or 2023, will provide that information publicly to anyone, academia, industry, policymakers, civil society, because we really do think that the better information that we have out there, the more progress we're going to make in actually reducing emissions.
Yes, and we appreciate that, Mark, because even those of us who do use emissions factors like to update them with the best available data, or at least to inform our sensitivity analyses around this. This is great. Jack also includes a follow-up question, which is, has the EDF engaged with Diversified Energy Company directly? There was a recent Bloomberg article about their huge ownership of dying wells in the US, in brackets, over 61.1 thousand of them.
Well, no, we haven't interacted with Diversified directly, but of course, some of the statistics I gave you on marginal wells, I think, are very much on point to the great reporting that Bloomberg did on this. Diversified may be a example of this, but they're not alone. And in fact, this is something we are concerned about as large companies like Shell and BP restructure their portfolios and work to quote unquote decarbonize. We're very concerned about assets being spun off into second and third owners, that doesn't do anything to reduce emissions, and in some ways may actually put these assets into the hands of people who are not as well equipped to manage them. So this is a big issue, I think, for all of us as we move through the energy transition.
Great question. And thank you for the answer. Jamie Kern asks, it sounds like technically, and this will be a broad question, because I do think questions of displacement are tricky, because it would technically require for there to be some retirement potentially, or some evidence that is certainly what exactly it's displacing, particularly as renewables become more competitive. So I'm going to say this in hopes that it will spark a little bit of debate from all of you. It sounds technically LNG from the Western United States could displace coal in Asia to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They ask, what about economically? How much might the fuel switch cost or save Asian utility companies? So there's the question about economics, but also the question of, technically, does it displace? I don't know who wants to start there. Bola?
Okay, yeah, as you mentioned, it's a tough question. When we do life cycle assessment analysis, we can only assume that it's displacing, such and such under different scenarios. but for sure, we cannot say that's exactly what is going to happen, as we all know that, right? So our analysis will only present, what we get based on our assumptions. So in our life cycle analysis for this latest report, we assume it's going to displace coal, but is that what is going to happen for sure? We don't know for sure. It's only based on our assumptions. And regarding how much of future renewables that is going to displace, and that's very difficult to answer and to tell, depending on a lot of factors that, are beyond our control. And in terms of cost, I think in 2019, S&P Global came up with a report that says that, even though the price of electricity generated from gas in China has reduced significantly, it was still maybe about 30% higher than that, generated from coal. For sure, a lot has changed in the last few weeks and the last few months based on, increase in the price of coal and gas as well. So it's a dynamic situation for sure.
Sarah, if I could, let me just jump in here real quick. I mean, so first of all, I think whether you look at the IPCC studies that were done about a year or so ago, or more recently, the IEA net zero scenario, it's pretty clear that in order for us to meet our targets under the Paris Agreement and to avoid the worst of climate change, we need to fundamentally reduce the total amount of fossil fuels that we're consuming. It's pretty much a no-brainer that we have to get ourselves off coal, but we're not looking at a scenario where we get off coal only to replace it with natural gas or oil, right? We're looking at a fundamental trajectory around the world where we are fundamentally consuming virtually no coal in the future and less gas and less oil than we are today. And really the only question is how quickly do we make that transition? So that's number one. Number two is comparing gas to coal. It's a little bit like saying, just because half the class is getting an E, a C is a good grade, right? We need to make sure that gas is an A student, not a C student. And that's where reducing methane emissions and capturing CO2 emissions from gas come in. So, that's gas's assignment, to become the A student here. And then the third point is these issues about how much energy is going to cost has to always be looked at in the context of the cost of not doing anything about climate change. Because the incremental additional cost of energy is being spent to avoid significant societal costs in terms of impact from climate change, whether that's infrastructure that's at risk, or public health that's at risk, or whether that's economic dislocation that's occurring, right? So you can never look at the cost of energy in isolation when you're talking about climate change. You always have to think about the benefits that you're getting for that cost.
Sir, if I may, I knew this would be a robust discussion, so just a quick point. So this is not Fiji George Cheniere speaking, this is IEA. So IEA identified fuel displacement from coal to gas as the quickest route to reducing emissions, with the potential of reducing global power sector emissions by 10%. The IEA estimates switching from coal to gas has already limited rising global CO2 emissions since 2010 and avoided 646 million tons of CO2 emissions between 2010 and 2019. So what does that mean? That's roughly equivalent to reducing all of Saudi Arabia's emissions in 2018 to zero. So you've got a technology that is right here, right now, that can help with the transition. Completely agree with Mark that we all need to be A students and get gas as clean as possible by tackling methane emissions. That's precisely what Cheniere is trying to do.
And just a couple quick comments and I'm going to ask Fiji again, the trajectory of the EIA, there is a little increase before it decreases too. So the importance of reducing those supply chain emissions can't be overemphasized. Fiji, did you have any additional thoughts on the costs? There was the actual question was, hey, so what does this mean for the costs to the Asian demand as they switch from hopefully higher carbon fuel to liquefied natural gas, because there are those additional costs associated with shipping and transport. So if you have any additional comments on that, that would be really great.
No, Sarah, unfortunately, I don't have any additional comments beyond what Bola just mentioned.
Okay, yeah, there's some interesting new economics from that, and obviously, you know, they're playing a role for off-taker agreements. We will go on to the next question, unless Andrew or Wes, did you have any additional comments before we move on?
I was going to remark, just kind of to follow on to the comment that natural gas producers need to be A students, and I, you know, frankly, couldn't agree more. I think there's a growing recognition among the upstream producers that decarbonization is the price of admission to play in these global markets. And you're seeing significant efforts in the Rockies, but also elsewhere to decarbonize, to implement technologies and practices that reduce methane. There's a number of initiatives. You know, I'll single out one future initiative, which is a broad agreement upstream across the natural gas supply chain to reduce emissions below 1%. They've already achieved that in 2019 to 0.334%. There are producers that in the Rockies that are down to 0.04% methane reductions, and those are kind of single cases, but I think it's a standard that industry should strive to and lead. And we need to remember that it's North America, but we're also competing against other LNG exporters globally, Russia and the Middle East. You know, that standards they should be held to as well. And those producers that are able to produce and export at that standard, you know, frankly, I hope to see a premium develop for them as well. So
yes, thank you. Yeah, no, wonderful, thank you. Mercedes as well before we go on to the next.
Yeah, very quickly, just to say that
your sound is coming across a bit strangely again. I don't know if you've changed.
No, I haven't changed anything.
Is there any way that you could maybe unplug just for a minute so that it was working there fine for a minute as well, unfortunately.
Is that better?
Very strangely not, but let's give it a shot. Maybe if.
Okay, so just to say very quickly that email the international.
Maybe just hang on again. Is there any way? What did you do last time during the sound check? Maybe try unplug and replug in. Did you try that? Unplugging and putting. Is it your mic? Can you unplug and then put it back in? It's very difficult to understand you, unfortunately.
Does it work?
Unfortunately not. Is there any way that you could not use your computer microphone?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you everyone for your patience. And we do have a number of other questions while Mercedes is working through the technical difficulties. We do have a couple of questions. We will be going over time by a little bit, but not by much because we started late. Oh, much better. Please do go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I hate these headphones, but I think they're much better. Okay, now just very briefly to say thanks for your patience that the International Methane Observatory is also open for companies to join it. And we very much hope that those companies that are making efforts to improve their sustainability by cutting and flaring and cutting methane emissions and monitoring their methane emissions will be part of that transparency effort, because as has been, as the point has been made, you know, we need to be able to see what methane emissions are coming from globally from the different parts of the world. And I think those, of course, those who are making the effort are very valuable to be able to integrate that in the observatory.
Oh, that's right. No, again, can't be overemphasized, and some of the analysis my group is doing right now just really emphasizes the variability and differences in terms of data availability and quality. So that's an excellent initiative. Okay, let's move to the next question. Okay, so the question is from Corey Paul, who says, what would it cost to deploy carbon capture at Sabine Pass? Does Cheniere have a dollars per ton figure for the carbon capture? What about the cost of replacing gas turbines with electric drives? Are these main opportunities for facility level emissions, or are these the main ones, or are there others that Cheniere has identified?
So let me start off with the last question. So what we at Cheniere do is the reason we've gone to a life cycle basis is to analyze the issue on a holistic way from the supply chain to the burner tip, right? Where are the potential reductions? So your question relates to CCS. We are evaluating CCS. We are running some numbers, but we're not ready at this time to make any public announcement on it. I would direct the questionnaire to the NPC, the National Petroleum Council report that was just completed recently. They've got some cost data over there, and it could give you a directional idea of the cost of implementation. So again, like I mentioned, we have a life cycle approach, a holistic basis approach. You know, your best reductions may come upstream of your plant, and you got to look at it from an LNG plant perspective. The most optimum source for CO2 reduction is what comes out from the acid gas removal unit. It's a rich stream CO2, but that is only about 10% of the total emissions. And then when you apply that across the life cycle, it's just less than 1%. So you got to really look at what is the fastest, quickest way of reducing emissions, and what role can we as a buyer of gas, we as an exporter of gas, can we play to effectuate those changes quickly?
Okay, we have a very scintillating question, which I know is going to be challenging to get through because there will be a lot of opinions. So I'm going to start with the last two and finish on the very controversial one. They're all very good. We will be going about 5 minutes over because we started late. So I'm going to ask them both at once because they're, I believe, individual panelists, but please do indicate if you'd like to jump in. One is to Fiji, who says, Mark Bolin says, Mr. George, how does your QMRV work compare to the OGMP level 5 reporting? Is the framework robust enough to support either differentiated natural gas or the trading of methane emissions credits in the event a fee on methane is established? That's the one question. And the next, I think particularly with the ongoing carbon border adjustment mechanisms in the EU is likely to Mercedes, but not to exclude the other speakers. Mark Bulling also asks, is it feasible to include methane emissions within a carbon border adjustment mechanism? So Fiji, then Mercedes, and then I'm going to open up to the last question, which I think will bring us very close to the end when Doug Hengel will close.
Sure. So Mark, good to get these questions back. So for those of you who don't know, Mark was my former boss. So as the professor in class, he always gives the tough questions. So just answer the Cheniere QMRV plan. It's very similar to OGMP level 5. I would say it's even further than level 5 because it not only requires you to try multiple technologies and do paired measurements, but it also asks you to do the application of, near continuous or enhanced continuous monitoring for a longer period. So it's not like most studies have just a spot check emission and then you extrapolate. Our analysis, we're looking at these facilities longer term, and then we have a double verification process by academics, not consultants, not anybody else, by academics. So it adds to the credibility. So eventually, once the data comes back to us, and this is an R&D program, by the way, this is not any differentiated gas or responsible gas program. So what we're hoping is once we learn more, the protocols that we have developed, we will try to make it open in the public domain after it's field tested. So I hope that answers that question. Now, what happens in the future with respect to other policies? I hope policymakers can use this work that we're doing as part of the armoire of a lot of other studies that the IMEO and others may consider in making sound policies, because that's what's required based on good science and good facts.
Thank you. Mercedes, please.
Yeah, thank you. I could not agree more with that last point. On the CBAM, well, CBAM is a, well, it's a measure that deserves its own seminar, but very briefly, just to say that this is part of the Fit for 55 package that the EU announced earlier this summer in July, and it will be applied to the following goods: cement, iron and steel, aluminium, fertilizers and electricity. So as it is designed right now, it applies to electricity, but that's electricity generated and imported from countries that wish to integrate their electricity markets in the EU. So as such, I believe it will not affect directly gas imports. Of course, CBAM will continue to evolve. What CBAM is designed to do is to avoid carbon leakage. So the phenomenon of importing goods that have a high carbon content and in lieu of producing them in the European Union. So in the long run, one could actually devise specific measures within CBAM, but the way it has been proposed to the legislators in the European Union, at the moment, it does not contain a specific provision on methane.
Okay, there we go. It's going to be interesting to watch that evolve. Okay, so the last one, we will start with Bola. The question is, and this is, again, a great question related to what we've spoken about before. So let's work with brevity. We'll do Bola, Fiji, and then open up for other comments in case the other speakers also want to make a comment. LNG life cycle models from Cheniere and Western tribes. Can you please explain the basis of your assumption that LNG is displacing coal in Asia rather than future renewable alternatives? This seems critical, particularly given that LNG contracts are typically long-term, so they risk locking in gas at the expense of renewable development, potentially for decades to come. And this also relates to other gas options. So it's a very good question. So Bola, perhaps we can start with you, go to Fiji, and then close with the rest.
Thank you, Sarah, for that question. I think one thing I always heard Andrew say all the time while we were conducting the study is that, first of all, as energy demand continues to increase, and we all know what has happened lately with shortage of energy across Europe and increasing prices all across the board, different sources. Andrew usually made a statement about the lowest hanging fruit, right? And the lowest hanging fruit in terms of LNG displacing or other sources of energy would be to displace coal. As we all know, based on the data that we have, based on all of the available information, I think it goes without saying that the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions from LNG, even when it's exported from North America to Asia, is still much lower than that. And I think different studies have corroborated that fact, still much lower than that of coal. So as Fiji mentioned earlier, what do we have here and now? We know that the development of renewables is not fast enough to meet the growing energy demand. So what do we have available right now to fill in the gap? I think it's natural gas. I think it goes without saying. I think that's the main reason why the assumption that it's going to be displacing coal, because coal is obviously the one with the highest life cycle greenhouse gas emissions for sure. So the fastest way to achieve the Paris, target is, of course, to remove coal from the energy mix as fast as possible.
Fiji?
Yeah, so just a couple of points. So if you go to cheniere.com, there is our transitional risk analysis. So where we have actually done the analysis of LNG demand under a less than 2 degree scenario, and where we stacked up the Cheniere projects relative to other projects. So just to answer Zorka's question is, if you really look at it, there will be a role that is needed for natural gas, right? And the idea now, that the thesis that we are pushing forth with life cycle analysis, like Bola mentioned, is how do we get to the A level, like Mark mentioned? How do we reduce methane? How can we not be just cost competitive relative to our other LNG suppliers and gas suppliers, but also competitive, when I use the term, from a methane and a carbon standpoint? So those are two key variables that have to be either rewarded or priced into the equation for the best gas to also be making economical sense. So in the assumption when we do these equilibrium models, or when IEA does the model, is they have already accounted for the growth of renewables. So we're looking at just the gas pie, and how do you get the cleanest supply in that gas pie? That will define the winners.
Okay, I'm going to ask for one sentence, maybe from Mark or Mercedes, if you have it, before we pass to Doug. If you do have any concluding remark.
Well, just on this issue of energy transition, I think look at the depreciation schedules that come along with the new assets that are being built. If someone is telling you that they're going to build a gas asset and it's going to have a 40-year or 50-year life, they're not really preparing for energy transition. They're sending you on the road to lock in. But I think that that becomes a bit of a test.
That's right. Yeah. And Mercedes, a very different energy mix in Europe. So different questions.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, in Europe, we do see a role for gas in our energy transition. But as I said before, it has to be linked with a very strong scrutiny on how sustainable the gas is and how strong the methane emissions reductions are. I'm not able to say how long that transition will take, but of course, as an importer of energy, for us, producing more renewables is also contributing to our energy independence. So that's what I will have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, some very good questions at the end. I am delighted now so the panel, thank you so much for your time. We're going to go a little bit over. So Doug, please do feel free to take 5 minutes. We do want to hear your opinion. So Doug is at SAIS, a faculty member at SAIS with myself, and also works for LNG Allies. So I wanted to emphasize that, of course, the goal of this event from my perspective in terms of organizing was to ensure that different perspectives are represented. So again, I want to thank tremendously all of you for bringing these different thoughts, and pass to Doug to close. So thank you very much for your patience, and for those still on the call. So the rest of us can turn our videos off and leave it to Doug. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah, for inviting me. I'm pleased to see a number of my current and former students in the audience here. And I just underline, these are personal perspectives on my part based on my background working on energy issues in the US government and wearing my other different hats. So I think what we heard here is further evidence that natural gas can help meet the climate challenge. The study that was presented today is consistent with others in that regard, but that more can be done to clean up gas, and that good regulation matters. I think responsible companies like Cheniere and its suppliers recognize they must do everything possible to push down emissions associated with gas production, processing, liquefaction, et cetera. This is key to the social license to operate. As Andrew Browning said, this is decarbonization upstream is the price of admission to play in local markets. So I think we all can agree that gas should be striving to be an A student. I think it's also clear that the world needs more energy and it wants more natural gas. This is particularly true in emerging Asia, as the Cheniere chart shows. Our gas in North America is clean, so that seems like a good fit. Everyone is going to use more renewable energy. That's growing by leaps and bounds, but renewables won't meet all the world's needs for some time, including for technical reasons. And at the moment, it's not clear if renewables will even meet the growth in global power demand every year. So if the world cannot have more natural gas, or if it's too expensive, it will use more coal. And we just heard why that's not a good idea. So Morgan Stanley issued an LNG demand outlook just in the last few days, and they note here that competing technologies for natural gas are not being developed fast enough, and there are significant benefits in reducing coal consumption while greener fuels are commercialized. Europe and Asia want our gas. They want the flexibility, the relatively low prices, the low emissions, and the lack of geopolitical baggage that comes with US gas. So the IEA emphasized in a recent statement about natural gas and electricity markets, that the links between electricity and natural gas are not going to go away anytime soon. As clean energy transitions advance towards net zero emissions, global gas demand will start to decline, but it will remain an important component of electricity security for some time to come, and that we can ensure that gases continue to play an essential role in managing large seasonal variations in electricity demand, the cleaner that it is. So I thought that Fareed Zakaria's recent column was pretty much spot on here, that we need a transition strategy, and a serious one would recognize the most important task is to reduce carbon emissions, and in the short term, the simplest way to do that is to move from coal to natural gas, which I think our discussion today highlighted. So I will stop there, and if this was an in-person event, I understand that this would be the time that Mark Brownstein might take out a few of his favorite single malts for a tasting, but I guess we'll have to take a rain check on that.
I am in Scotland right now, Doug, so I'll raise a best for you.